Laura Bicker, BBC Korea correspondent, who calls Dokdo by Freaky Way. She is wrong. From the start, the U.S. government has never uttered South Korea as one of the candidates for the Afghan refugee. Unlike the U.S. press's intended spreading thoughtlessly, since Mark Thiessen of Washington Post mocked South Korea will collapse once USFK leave. The article was not come from any official channel. Either. Also, what you uttered the latter belongs to those who assisted for Korean project in Afghan, except the refugee. She should have been more careful, if she regarded herself as a correspondent. It is her biggest problem to always report such important reports in fragments without fact-checking. Can she speak or read Korean or write articles in Korean? This is because a thoughtless word from her can cause a bigger threat, due to negligence of not taking into account the feelings of the local government and local Koreans at all. As many reporters from Reuters and BBC correspondents didn't know, Korea could complete the mission safely, like in other countries, by carrying out the mission under a thorough embargo so that the Japan media, whereas neighboring Korea didn't notice. In addition to Reuters in the World section, which part the local assistant take the foreign correspondent's routine task, mainly, seems not to know the elements of journalism. For children, identity protection is the essential. Not only for the animal. Eventually, she reacted against me, then she emphasized that Koreans are Islamic phobia and she advocated her national patriotism of Great Britain. Her hypocrisy might come from her unstable freelance life. As if the U.S. media emphasizes cruel Taliban, whereas spotlighting the U.S. troops' kindness. However, it brings more crisis from inside to outside. Like the current chaos in Armageddon, if she is stubborn that she's likely to flatter only. When I uttered the recent Palestinian and Israel between Gaza, 3 idiots Owen, Laura, Ned simultaneously reacted by Burma issue. But it was disappeared more quickly than I expected. In fact, I implied Burma at the last voicemail of May 18 movement and CIA lies. But no matter how Burma is compared to Taiwan, it looks unnatural that the U.S. spokesperson on Twitter overprotect Taiwan than Burma, unlike Afghan. However, as the above, and later, one another reacted me, maliciously. He turned to show off his masculinity, excuse me, whereas she pretended to be attacked by Korean males. Although I don't have a mind to advocate anyone, I felt both of Owen and Laura are disgusting. Although I'd like to say more about it, I advise them, seriously. Don't be evil. Even if you're eager to be famous, don't be cowardly. Your behavior and attitude itself shows who you are or what it is, capitalism itself. You might think it dirty, but none is more greedy than you. CNN makes the fake news. New York Times spread the intentional war incitement lie, and Washington Post makes by malicious words, and your freaky call of Dokdo, under the brand of BBC. Needless to say, Wall Street Journal. With Reuters, feathers flock together. Laura Bicker fell into self-pity. Oh, yeah, she regarded me as a male who harassed females. Hey, bitch, she heard this one, she reacts like adult ADHD. This case study of Western criteria hubris, it is not at all humanitarian nor rational. The so-called the animal activist who invaded others' workplace to bother their routine work for her ideology. If she listens to this, she might have lost herself, after another female editor of New York Times. Is there nobody to say her, that Dokdo is not a conflict zone, but Korean homeland? How long have she been in Korea, so far? I guess that aka former editor of Reuters in Korea might have spread the latest fake news, intentionally. Addition to, he seems to assist her main task. Or to take her task mainly, nonetheless, how can he ignore that she said Dokdo is a conflict zone? Hello Korean students preparing for Korean SAT. I'm putting it on the table to show Dokdo that it takes to get through Korean history. But so far all the foreign correspondents in Seoul. I'd like to let you know their bystander background, so if anyone is interested, listen to me. Most of foreign correspondents in Korea don't speak Korean. Just like when I studied English at British Council, the instructor said they didn't have to study Korean. Just because students do the task of correspondence instead of them doesn't do anything helpful to students' careers. Nevertheless, if Korean students long for it, I recommend Kong Hung-won, the former AP photojournalist who was awarded the Pulitzer Prize over twice. Try with confidence. Ask for him. Better than me. He immigrated to the United States in 1977, when he was a freshman in middle school, but has kept his Korean name for the rest of his life, and he is frustrated by this attitude of Americans. He, who has interviewed a reporter 3 times since last year, said, "Professors and students studied a lot about the Soviet Union and China. But they did not give much weight to Korean history and culture." However, it is a sad reality that Japan and China's historical and cultural distortions are still widely shared in the West. Next is what I heard from Professor Richard Baum in 1984 by Kong Hung-won, a third-year student in the Department of Political Science and Diplomacy at UCLA, who dreamed of becoming a diplomat as a 1.5-generation American immigrant. "I don't know much about Korea. What is the meaning of knowing Korea?" Professor Baum, who served as a diplomatic advisor to Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, was knowledgeable enough to speak Mandarin about China. But he dismissed Korea as meaningless. Today's global BTS craze and other Hallyu winds make it difficult to see. But it is a sad reality that Japan and China's historical and cultural distortions are still widely shared in the West, he said. Kong Hung-won does not ignore the distortions of Japanese and Chinese history and culture. In the reality that China insists that kimchi is theirs since last year. He visits the kimchi site and digs into the origins as well as the recipe. Following the history of Gojoseon, Goguryeo, and Balhae, China claims that kimchi, hanbo, pansori, ararang, and samgyetang are also theirs. Even in a TV show, there was a lot of controversy about the fact that the Korean national flag, taguki, was made by a Chinese. And he also introduces that the taguki contains a symbol of Eastern yin-yang thought created by our ancestors, the Dongyi people. It is also said that there is no place where Buddhism has settled and blossomed as splendidly as in Korea compared to India or China. Historically and effectively, it explores Dokdo, our territory, and vividly criticizes Japan's false claims. He also introduced the memorial monuments of dozens of fishermen who died in the 1948 U.S. Air Force bombing of Dokdo while visiting Dokdo. In 1948, he visited the site of the Jeju April 3rd uprising, and for 3 years after liberation, the U.S. military government denounced the painful history of aiding and leading the genocide by the police, Northwest Youth Corps, and soldiers against the Jeju people who wanted a unified homeland because they were ignorant of the Korean situation. I am a citizen of the United States and have been active in the local mainstream media for over 30 years, so I want to introduce Korea's history and culture objectively to Western society. Lately, an American professor of history in Washington, Ed Husain, said on Twitter, "Blaming America is easy. But ask why is it Germans, Koreans, Russians, Austrians, today's Japanese do not produce suicide bombers? All were empires. All lost power. Why is it activist Muslim politics cannot adapt to the modern world? Political Islamism kills. This is my turn for mirroring. Blaming Japan is easy. But why ask it Germans, Koreans, Chinese, condemning today's Japanese? Where did it produce the suicide bomber in Pacific War of World War II? One of all was an empire. Only one has sustained the power, under General MacArthur's dirty deal in the USA, since 1945. Why is he the well-educated professor? But a little insufficient part to advocate Muslim politics science at the university, based in the USA cannot adopt to the diversity in the America? Political militarism kills. Perhaps he found the word empire in a sentence I wrote a few days ago. As I mentioned before, ignorance is not replaced by innocence. And I think it's more virulent than definite indifference. What was he ultimately looking for? In the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Korea and China, the victims, were unable to participate. UK intended to accept Dokdo out of Korean territory because of Britain's side with Japan. At least, even the Taliban were not as ignorant as this. I was disappointed with the U.S. Professor of Islamic Community. In Korea, there are many interpreters and volunteers who can help Afghan contributors settle in Korea. It's nothing for you to worry about. They will also tell Afghans about Korean culture. Contrary to the Harvard president's concern, I have never regretted that my ancestors were Asians. Is it yesterday said the U.S. government gave the Taliban negotiator a list of assistants left in the chaos? Although it is for departure procedures. I think the U.S. trusts and relies on the Taliban more than Korea. About this issue, I'd like not to boost Korea for another patriotisms, near to nationalism, unlike some of Korean journos. So I don't utter about this issue any longer. Wish peace.